I lay motionless in the ICU, listening to the cold, relentless beeping of the heart monitor as pain pinned my entire body to the bed. Then the door slowly opened. A nurse stepped inside, carrying the unmistakable scent of lavender, my late wife's favorite perfume. She placed an icy hand on my forehead, leaned close, and whispered, "Don't be afraid. Your wife sent me. She said, it's time to bring you home." The monitor suddenly erupted into frantic alarms. My wife had been buried 3 years ago. So, who was standing beside me? Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me where are you watching from? Your city or country? I'd love to know. Welcome to Revenge, Dad. This story contains fictional elements added for entertainment and educational purposes. Names and settings are coincidental, but the message it carries is one worth keeping. The morning Eleanor died, she told me the lavender would come back on its own. I didn't believe her. Then I stood at her bedside in that small room that smelled of old wood and medicine, and I told her I'd never been good at keeping things alive without her help. She laughed at that, a short, tired laugh that cost her more than she let on. And she reached up and pressed her hand against my jaw the way she had done 10,000 times before. "You'll figure it out, Walter," she said. "You always do." 3 years later, every October, the lavender came back. I thought about that on the morning everything changed. I was walking the south fence line the way I did every day at 6:30. Coffee thermos in my left hand. The collar of my flannel jacket turned up against the chill that rolled down off the Blue Ridge before sunrise. The Shenandoah Valley in October smelled like wood smoke and wet earth. And something else I could never name, something that felt like the land itself exhaling after a long summer. 45 acres. Eleanor and I had bought them when we were 31 years old with money we didn't really have, signing papers on a kitchen table in a real estate office in Harrisonburg while the agent kept glancing at our worn shoes. We built everything on this land. The farmhouse, the equipment barn, the fencing that now needed a new post every other season, which I fixed myself because Eleanor always said a man who couldn't fix his own fence had no business owning one. I was 72 years old, and I still fixed my own fence. I figured she would have approved. The gravel road that ran along the property's eastern edge curved gently before it met Route 11, and I had walked that curve so many thousands of times that my boots knew it without my eyes. I was thinking about the back pasture drainage. There had been heavy rain the week before, and the ground near the old oak was pooling when I heard the engine. Not the usual sound of a farm truck heading into town. Something idling, waiting. I looked up. The pickup was dark blue, older model, parked just past the curve with its engine running. I noticed it the way you notice something that doesn't quite fit, the way Eleanor used to say, I noticed everything 2 seconds before I admitted I was noticing it. The truck hadn't been there when I started my walk. There was no reason for a vehicle to be idling on that stretch of road at 6:30 in the morning. I kept walking. Force of habit. You don't stop and stare in the country. You keep moving, and you watch from the corner of your eye. That was my mistake. The engine revved. Not a lurch, not a skid, a deliberate acceleration, controlled and angled, the kind that comes from someone who has decided on a direction and committed to it. He turned toward the sound, and the front corner of that truck caught me just below the left hip, hard enough to send the thermos spinning out of my hand and the ground coming up to meet me with a force that knocked every thought clean out of my head. He hit the gravel shoulder and felt 2 things happen at once. A white-hot snap of pain along my left side that told me something had given way, and a strange floating quiet that settled over me like a blanket dropped from a great height. My cheek was against the cold gravel. I could smell the wet earth and the exhaust from the truck, and faintly beneath both of those, something floral and impossible. Lavender. I tried to push myself up, and my left arm buckled, and the pain came roaring back so loud I heard it in my teeth. 2 ribs, maybe 3. I had broken ribs before, years ago on a construction site, and I recognized the particular breathless quality of the injury. The way it turned every inhale into a negotiation. I lay still. The smart thing to do. Keep your airway clear. Don't aggravate a spinal injury. Wait for someone to come. Eleanor had made me take a first aid refresher course when I turned 65, and I had complained about it the entire drive to Harrisonburg, and she had told me to stop being dramatic. I was glad for it now. The truck's engine was still running. I turned my head just slightly, the gravel grinding against my cheekbone, and I could see the truck sitting 20 yards back up the road. They laughed. The driver's side window was down, but the morning light was coming at the wrong angle, and I couldn't make out a face, just a shape, a silhouette behind the wheel, watching. "Hey," I said. My voice came out thinner than I intended, scraped down by the pain. "Hey, I need help." The silhouette didn't move. My heart was hammering now. Not from the fall, not entirely, but from something older and more instinctive, the part of a person's brain that has been reading situations for 7 decades and knows when something is wrong. This wasn't an accident. The positioning was too deliberate. The waiting afterward was too deliberate. In 40 years of driving farm roads, I had never once seen a vehicle idle beside an injured man without the driver jumping out. I tried to reach for my phone and realized it had skittered out of my jacket pocket when I hit the ground. I could see it in the gravel 4 feet away, screen face down, completely out of reach. The truck's engine changed pitch, not revving up, pulling away slow, moving back up Route 11 the way it had come, as if it had accomplished exactly what it set out to do and had no particular reason to rush. I listened to the sound of it fade. The pain in my ribs was enormous now, spreading upward with every breath, and the cold from the gravel was working its way through my jacket, and the lavender smell, impossible out of season. Not a single plant within 30 yards of where I lay had gone with the truck as if it had never been there at all. "Eleanor," I said to no one, to the empty road and the cold October sky and the 45 acres of land we had built together out of nothing. The only answer was the wind coming off the mountains, moving through the fence grass. And somewhere back at the farmhouse, the screen door catching in the breeze the way it always did when I left it unlatched. Then the darkness came. The first thing I saw when I opened my eyes was a ceiling tile with a water stain shaped like the state of Florida. The second thing I saw was Russell. He was standing at the foot of the bed with his arms crossed and his face arranged into an expression I recognized from his childhood. The look he wore when he'd broken something and was rehearsing his explanation before anyone asked. Concern carefully applied. Grief measured out in precise amounts. He had always been good at that. My son, good at wearing the right face for the room. That. He uncrossed his arms and moved to the side of the bed, and his voice dropped into something soft and careful. "Dad, can you hear me? Squeeze my hand if you can hear me." My left side felt like someone had filled it with broken glass. Every breath I drew scraped against something that wasn't supposed to move, and the effort of it made my vision swim at the edges. 2 ribs, maybe 3, the same assessment I'd made on the road, still holding. My head felt wrong, too heavy, packed with cotton. That was the medication. I could feel the 4 in the back of my left hand, the thin, cold threat of it running up my arm. I squeezed Russell's hand. He exhaled a performance of relief and turned toward the doorway. Diane, he's awake. Diane came in from the hallway carrying 2 paper cups of coffee from the vending machine down the hall. She was 41 years old, and she had her mother's bone structure and none of her mother's warmth. And when she saw me looking at her, she arranged her face into something that was meant to resemble anguish. Her eyes were dry. He noticed that. Eleanor, when she cried from somewhere real. Her whole face changed. Her chin trembled. Her breath hitched in a way she couldn't control. Diana's face changed in a way that looked studied. "Oh, Daddy." She set the cups down on the tray table and reached for my free hand, and her fingers were cool and smooth. We were so scared. The hospital called us, and we drove straight here. We didn't even stop. We were just, she pressed my hand against her cheek and closed her eyes. "We're just so glad you're okay." I was not okay, but I didn't say that. The door opened again, and a man I didn't recognize walked in wearing a white coat and the particular brand of confidence that doctors develop after years of being the most important person in whatever room they enter. It was maybe 55, silver at the temples with the kind of tan you get from weekend golf rather than outdoor work. Mr. Holt, he extended his hand. "I'm Dr. Gerald Shaw, Chief of the ICU here at Blue Ridge Regional. We've been monitoring you closely since you came in this afternoon." He shook his hand. My grip was weaker than I wanted it to be. "Your son and daughter have been here since you arrived. Doctor." Shaw continued, moving to the monitor beside my bed and studying the readout with the focused attention of a man who wanted to appear thorough. "We've completed a full neurological workup. The good news is that your ribs, 2 fractures on the left side, are manageable. No surgical intervention needed." It paused, and in that pause, I felt something shift in the room. A slight change in pressure, the way the air feels before a storm comes in off the mountains. However, the imaging also revealed some concerning findings. There's evidence of intracranial trauma, bleeding between the brain and the skull that's affecting cognitive function. Combined with the impact trauma, we're seeing indicators consistent with significant loss of executive capacity. He looked at him. In plain language, Dr. Shaw said, and he looked directly at me with eyes that were professionally kind and completely empty. "The accident has caused a level of neurological damage that affects your ability to make decisions for yourself. We need to monitor this carefully over the coming days." My ribs screamed with every breath I took. My head felt wrong from the medication. But my mind, the part of me that had engineered load-bearing structures for 30 years, that had read blueprints and calculated tolerances and caught errors that younger men missed, my mind was working exactly as it always had. He knew what I felt. He knew what was real, and what Dr. Shaw was describing was not real. He kept my face still. It cost me something to do it. Some internal effort that felt like holding a door shut against a strong wind. But I kept my face still, and I let my eyes go slightly unfocused, the way eyes look when the person behind them has retreated somewhere far away. It was a performance, and I was not naturally a performer, but I had spent 40 years reading people on job sites, reading who was cutting corners, who was lying about timelines, who was afraid and covering it with noise. And I understood in that moment that performing was exactly what I needed to do. Russell was watching Dr. Shaw with an expression of practiced sorrow. But his shoulders had dropped. Tension releasing, the specific loosening of a man who has just heard the answer he was hoping for. That was the thing that made my chest tighten harder than the broken ribs ever could. Not the false diagnosis, not the doctor's empty eyes. It was my son's shoulders dropping with relief at the news that his father's mind was gone. We want to discuss next steps with the family, Doctor. Cho said, directing this at Russell rather than at me, as if I had already become a subject to be discussed rather than a person to be addressed. There are some forms we'll need to get in order given Mr. Holt's current situation. Of course, Russell said, whatever you need, we're here for him. Dr. Shaw nodded and made a note on his tablet and walked out of the room. And I watched him go through as I was keeping carefully vague, and I thought about the way he had said forms with the practiced neutrality of a man who has said a particular word so many times it has lost its edges. Diane was still holding my hand. She had started talking, something about the farm, about how they would make sure everything was taken care of, how I didn't need to worry about anything anymore. Her voice had taken on a tone I associated with people speaking to very young children or very old dogs. He let my head fall slightly to the side toward the window. Outside, the Blue Ridge was going purple in the early evening light. The ridgeline I had looked at every day for 40 years. And somewhere beyond it was my farm, my fence line, Eleanor's lavender, the screen door that caught in the wind. That was when I saw it. Russell had moved to the window to take a phone call, turning his back to the room, and in the glass, the reflection of the glass, I could see his face. He was smiling, not the careful, grief-adjacent expression he'd been wearing since I opened my eyes. A real smile, small and private and satisfied, the smile of a man who has just watched a plan fall into place. It caught himself after a second and smoothed it away, but I had seen it, and the seeing of it drove something cold and sharp directly into the center of my chest that had nothing to do with broken ribs. He turned my eyes back to the ceiling tile. Florida. The water stain still looked like Florida. He stared at it and breathed through the pain and did not let my face change. And somewhere beneath the medication and the fear and the grief that was always present now, 3 years running, I felt something else begin to take shape. Rizal. The ICU at night is a different kind of place. During the day, it runs on noise and motion, carts rolling past, voices overlapping in the hallway, the steady percussion of monitors and call buttons, and footsteps that never quite stop. But after 10. 00, the ward pulled inward, the overhead lights dimming to something closer to dusk, and the sounds thinned out until all that was left was the mechanical breathing of the building itself and the occasional soft footfall of a night nurse making rounds. He lay in the dark, and I did not sleep. My ribs made sleep nearly impossible anyway. Every position I tried compressed something that protested, and the pain medication they had given me had worn down to a dull background roar rather than the blunted numbness of the first hours. He was aware of my own breathing in a way I hadn't been since I was a young man on a job site with a bad fall behind me. Each inhale a careful negotiation, each exhale a controlled release. Russell and Diane had stayed until nearly 9. Russell spent most of that time on his phone in the corner of the room, his back to me, speaking in a voice low enough that I caught fragments rather than sentences. Diane sat beside my bed and talked at me with the relentless cheerfulness of someone filling silence they were afraid of. The farm, the weather, a neighbor's new barn she'd driven past on the way in. She didn't ask me questions. That told me something. A person who believes someone else can't understand them stops asking questions. She had already written me off. He kept my eyes soft and my face slack, and I listened to every word. They left together just before 9. Diane kissing my forehead with lips that barely touched skin. Russell squeezing my shoulder with a hand that felt like a formality. He watched them go through the glass panel beside the door. They walked down the hallway side by side, and at the elevator, Russell said something to Diane, and she nodded, and he put his hand briefly on the back of her neck. The way you touch someone you're steering rather than comforting. Then they stopped. Not at the elevator, 10 feet short of it, just outside the range of my room's direct sideline, but angled so that their voices, dropping into something more direct now that they believed no one was listening, carried back through the gap at the bottom of my door with a clarity that the quiet of the late-night ward made almost cruel. He turned my head toward the door slowly, every degree of movement costing me something. Shaw confirmed the filing went through. Russell's voice, stripped of the careful softness he'd used in my room. Flat and businesslike. Emergency petition is on the docket. 14 days to the hearing. Maybe less if Callum moves it up. Kajum. A judge's name. He filed it away. 14 days. Diane's voice was tighter than it had been all evening. That's 2 weeks, Russell. What if he starts showing? He won't, Russell cut her off. Cho was very clear. The dosage he's on for the pain management is going to keep him foggy for at least the next 72 hours. And by the time it clears, we'll have the forms in order. Cho signed the capacity evaluation this afternoon. It's done, Diane. It's done. My chest tightened so sharply that for a moment I thought it was the ribs again. But it wasn't the ribs. It was something colder and deeper than physical pain. The recognition arriving fully formed and undeniable that this had been planned, not improvised in the shock of an accident. Planned. The petition already filed, the judge's name already known, the doctor already paid, and the evaluation already signed on the same afternoon I'd been admitted. They had been ready. What about the farm? Diane asked. The buyer is he still. He's not going anywhere, Russell said, and I could hear the satisfaction in it, thick and unguarded, the way a person sounds when they've stopped performing and started feeling. 20 acres of Shenandoah Valley land with water rights and road access doesn't sit on the market, Diane. AJ wait 2 weeks. 20 acres. I was going to carve the farm up. Not sell it whole. Carve it. Sell off the eastern section with the creek and the road frontage. The section Eleanor and I had always called the good land. The land where she used to walk in the evenings when she wanted to think. My hands, lying flat on the blanket at my sides, curled slowly into fists. He felt the pull of it across my knuckles. Felt the four-line tug slightly with the movement. And I made myself stop. Made myself open my hands back to flat. Made myself breathe through the pain and the rage that was building behind my sternum with a heat I hadn't felt in years. Not yet. Not yet. And the nursing home? Diane again. She was the one who needed reassurance. Russell had always been the one who moved forward. Diane had always been the one who needed the plan explained twice. Stanton, Russell said. It's 40 miles from here. Private facility, memory care unit. Once the conservatorship goes through and we have authority over his placement, we move him within the week. The farm goes on the market the following Monday. Memory care. They were going to put me in a memory care unit, a locked ward for people who didn't know what year it was, who called out for people who had been dead for decades, who needed someone to help them find the bathroom. They were going to take my land, sell off Eleanor's good acres, lock me in a room 40 miles away, and they were going to do all of it with the blessing of a court that had been handed a fraudulent medical evaluation by a doctor who had been paid to lie. A sound escaped me. I couldn't stop it entirely. A short, sharp exhale through my nose that was 1 degree removed from a sound I hadn't made since the morning Eleanor died. He turned it into a cough. In the hallway, Russell and Diane went quiet for 2 seconds. Then Diane said, "Should we check on him?" And Russell said, "Shaw said he'd be out until morning. Leave him." And their voices moved away toward the elevator. And I heard the soft chime of the doors opening and the silence that followed when they closed. He lay in the dark for a long time after that. The monitor beside me tracked my heartbeat with patient indifference. A sound I had started to find almost comforting in its consistency. The one thing in this room that wasn't performing anything, just reporting, just saying, "Still here. Still here, still here." He thought about Eleanor. He thought about the evening 2 years before she died when she had come in from one of her long walks on the good land and stood in the kitchen doorway with her boots still on and looked at me with an expression I had never been able to fully read. Not sad exactly, not afraid, something older than both of those. She had looked at me for a long moment, and then she had said quietly, almost to herself, "I just want to make sure you'll be all right, Walter." After I had told her to stop talking like that, she had smiled and changed the subject. She had known something even then. She had been walking her good land, and she had known something, and she had not yet figured out how to tell me. I should have listened harder, I said, to the dark room, to the ceiling tile with its Florida-shaped water stain, to the monitor that kept faithfully reporting my presence. My voice was barely above a breath, roughened by pain and something rawer than pain. I should have listened so much harder, Eleanor. The building hummed around me. Somewhere down the hall, a cart moved. Somewhere above the drop ceiling, the ventilation system pushed air through ducts that ran the length of the ward. I made myself think clearly. Through the pain and the grief and the anger that wanted to burn everything down, I made myself think with the same deliberate precision I had used for 30 years when a structure wasn't behaving the way the math said it should. Identify what you know. Identify what you don't know. Find the load-bearing element. What I knew, Russell had filed for emergency conservatorship. Dr. Shaw had been paid to falsify my evaluation. A hearing was 14 days away. A nursing home in Staunton was already selected. A buyer for the eastern acreage was already waiting. What I didn't know, whether anyone outside this room was working against this. Whether Eleanor had left anything behind that could help me. Whether there was still time. What I needed to find out starting tomorrow. Starting with every foggy, slack-jawed, apparently empty-headed minute I could give them, was whether the answer to any of those questions was yes. I closed my eyes. Hold on, I told myself. Hold on, and pay attention, and don't give them a single thing they can use. Outside, the Blue Ridge sat dark against a darker sky, and the farm sat under the stars the way it always did, and Eleanor's lavender, impossible out of season, but present somewhere beneath everything else, moved in whatever wind was blowing off the mountain tonight. The second night was worse than the first. Not because of the pain, though the pain was still there. A deep, grinding presence along my left side that made every position feel like a negotiation I was losing. Not because of the fear, though that was present, though, sitting in the corner of the room the way certain thoughts sit when you can't afford to look at them directly. The second night was worse because I understood fully and without the buffer of shock exactly what was happening to me. They had planned this, every piece of it, and the hearing was now 13 days away. He had spent the daylight hours of the second day performing. Russell had come in the morning with a woman I didn't recognize, late 40s, dark blazer, a leather portfolio tucked under her arm, and introduced her as a family friend who handles financial matters. I had looked at the woman with carefully empty eyes, and she had looked back at me with the practiced neutrality of someone accustomed to looking at people who couldn't look back meaningfully. She had said something to Russell in a low voice. He had nodded. They had both left within 20 minutes, and I had lain in my bed, staring at the ceiling tile with the Florida water stain, and catalogued every detail of what I had just seen. Financial matters. A woman with a leather portfolio. 20 minutes. Diane had come in the afternoon alone this time and sat beside me for 2 hours reading something on her phone. She talked occasionally, filling silence the way she always had, words arranged to take up space rather than communicate. And I responded with the occasional slow blink or unfocused shift of my eyes. And she patted my hand twice and told me not to worry about anything. He was worrying about everything. But yes, both of them had gone again, and the ward had settled into its nighttime rhythms. And I lay in the dark with 13 days counting down behind my eyes and the particular helplessness of a man who knows exactly what is being done to him and cannot yet see the way out. That was when I smelled it. Lavender. Not the ghost of it, the way I sometimes caught it in rooms Eleanor had been in years before, a trace that might have been memory as much as reality. This was present and immediate, a real thing moving through the antiseptic air of the ICU with a specificity that made my breath catch against my broken ribs. Eleanor had worn the same French lavender water for 31 years, a small blue bottle she ordered twice a year from a shop in Charlottesville. I knew that scent the way I knew the sound of her voice, not as information, but as something deeper, something that bypassed thought entirely and landed somewhere behind the sternum. The door opened softly. The way you open a door when you are trying not to wake someone, or when you are very practiced at moving without being heard. The woman who came in was wearing scrubs and a surgical mask, and her hair was pulled back beneath a cap, and she moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this particular route through this particular room many times before. She checked the monitor without touching it. She adjusted something near the floor stand, or appeared to. And then she came to the side of the bed, and she placed her hand on my forehead. Her hand was cool and steady, not clinical. The way you put your hand on someone's forehead when you are checking on them rather than checking their temperature. There was something human in it that the rest of the ICU's touches had not had. He kept my eyes closed, kept my breathing slow. She leaned down, and I felt the warmth of her breath near my ear. And she spoke in a voice so low it barely qualified as sound. Don't be afraid, Mr. Holt. A pause, one beat, two. Eleanor sent me. She said it's time to bring you home. The monitor beside me went off. Not a full alarm, a short, urgent series of tones that the machine produces when heart rate spikes beyond a certain threshold. And my heart had just spiked beyond that threshold with a violence that sent a hot wave of pain through my broken ribs and flooded my eyes with sudden, helpless tears that I could not stop and did not try to stop because there was no performance adequate to what I was feeling in that moment. Eleanor. 3 years gone. 3 years of silence and lavender coming back on its own every October. And the screen door catching in the wind. 3 years of talking to her in empty rooms and telling myself it was just habit, just the shape grief takes when it has nowhere else to go. Eleanor sent me. The woman reached past me with a calm, unhurried movement and silenced the monitor before a nurse could respond to the alert. Her hand returned to my arm, not gripping, just present, the way you steady something that is in danger of tipping. "You're safe," she said quietly. "But I need you to listen. Can you hear me?" I opened my eyes. She was close enough that I could see her eyes above the mask, dark brown, steady, carrying the particular kind of composure that belongs to people who have been afraid before and learned how to function through it. She held my gaze for a moment, and I saw her read something in my face, the fact that I was here fully, not the empty admin I'd been performing all day. And she gave a single small nod. "Good," she said. "I wasn't sure how much they'd given you." "Not enough to matter," I said. My voice came out rough and low, scraped down by 2 days of disuse and pain medication and grief. "Who are you?" "Patricia Lane. eBay worked this ward for 6 years." She reached into the pocket of her scrubs and produced a small card, thick paper the size of a business card, and placed it carefully in my hand, folding my fingers over it. "Eleanor came to me 3 years ago," she said. "If something happened to you, if you ended up here or somewhere like here in a situation you didn't choose, she wanted you to have this." My fingers tightened around the card so hard my knuckles ached. She made me memorize the phrase. Patricia continued, her voice barely above breath. "She said you'd know what it meant, that you'd understand. It wasn't that it wasn't what it sounded like. She was very specific about that." Something shifted in Patricia's eyes, something that wasn't quite grief but was adjacent to it. "She loved you very much, Mr. Holt. She talked about you like you were the thing that made sense of everything else." The tears on my face had reached my jaw. I didn't wet them. My hand was occupied with the card, and the rest of me was occupied with not coming apart at the seams in a hospital bed at 2 in the morning while a woman I had never met told me my dead wife had loved me. "The card," I managed. "What does it mean?" "There's a number sequence on the front. It's a verification code." Patricia glanced once at the door, then back to me, quick and professional. "There's a man named Conrad Briggs. He's been working on your behalf for 3 years. When you're ready, when you have a way to reach him, that code tells him you're you and not someone claiming to be you." Eleanor's instructions were very specific about the verification. She paused. "She said you'd understand why. She said you always understood the importance of load-bearing structures." He made a sound then that I had no name for, a short, broken exhale that started somewhere near my sternum and came out changed. "Because that was Eleanor's phrase, said in Eleanor's cadence, the exact way she had always described my work when she was trying to explain it to people who didn't understand engineering. Walter understands load-bearing structures. He always knows what's holding everything up." She had sent me a message written in our language. Patricia reached past me one more time, and I felt a slight movement near the lower frame of the wheelchair that had been positioned beside my bed. A barely there adjustment lasting less than 2 seconds. "Your wheelchair," she said. "The small device attached to the lower left crossbar is yours. It belongs to you. If you ever need to, if there's a conversation you need to remember, the activation is a press of your right heel against the footrest." 3 seconds. She met my eyes again. "You understand?" "One party consent," I said. "Virginia law. As long as I'm present in the conversation." Something that might have been relief moved across her eyes. Eleanor said you'd get there fast. She straightened up and became a nurse again in a single smooth motion, adjusting the monitor, making a small notation on the tablet at the end of my bed, moving toward the door with the unhurried efficiency of someone completing a routine task. At the door, she paused with her back to me, not turning around. She planned for this for 2 years before she passed, Patricia said quietly. She didn't want you to face it without someone in your corner. A breath. You have someone in your corner, Mr. Holt. The door closed. I lay in the dark with the card closed in my fist and the lavender still faintly present in the air and the tears drying on my face. And I pressed the small, hard rectangle of thick paper against my chest over my heart. Over the place where the grief had lived for 3 years like a stone that nothing could move. He turned the card over with fingers that would not quite stop trembling. On the front, a sequence of numbers, 12 digits written in ink, I recognized even in the low light of the ICU. On the back, 3 words in the handwriting I had known for 40 years. Chose 10. He did not sleep after Patricia left. He lay in the narrow hospital bed with the card pressed flat against my chest beneath the blanket, my broken ribs measuring out the dark in increments of pain. And I let my mind go back to Eleanor. The way you go back to a place you left in a hurry, looking for the things you missed the first time through. She had known something. The card in my hand was proof of that. 3 years of planning, 2 years of working with a man named Conrad Briggs. A code phrase delivered in a hospital room at 2 pulgadas the morning. None of that happens by accident. None of that happens without a reason. He had been married to Eleanor Holt for 41 years. I knew the architecture of her mind the way I knew the architecture of a well-built structure, where the weight sat, where the load transferred, which elements were decorative, and which ones were actually holding everything up. She did not worry without cause. She did not act without reason. And she did not keep things from me except when she believed, with the particular certainty she reserved for matters she had thought through completely, that keeping them from me was the right thing to do. So I went back. He went back through the last 2 years of her life, and I looked at everything differently. The walks. Eleanor had always walked in the evenings, out through the back pasture, along the creek, up to the ridge where you could see the valley laid out below in the lone light. It was the thing she did when she needed to think, and I had never questioned it because Eleanor had always needed to walk to think, and the farm had always given her room to do it. But in the last 2 years before she died, the walks had changed. Long hair, more frequent, and sometimes I could see it now, could see it in a way I hadn't let myself see it then. She came back from those walks with a quietness that was different from her ordinary quiet. Not peaceful, resolve. The quietness of someone who has made a decision and is living with it. He had asked her once in the kitchen after dinner what she was thinking about out there. She had looked at me across the table with those gray eyes that I had spent 4 decades learning to read, and she had said, the farm. Making sure it stays what it's supposed to be. He had thought she meant the drainage in the back pasture. She had meant Russell and Diane. The money came back to me now. 3 years ago, 6 months before Eleanor died, Russell had come to us with an investment opportunity, a development project in the valley, commercial real estate. The kind of thing that sounded reasonable until you looked at the numbers carefully enough to see the edges. He had wanted us to put in $400,000. Eleanor had said no before I finished reading the prospectus, and she had said it in a way that closed the conversation so completely that Russell hadn't brought it up again, and I had been mildly surprised at the firmness of it but had not pushed. Now I understood. She hadn't been saying no to an investment. She had been saying no to the first test, because that was what it had been. I could see it clearly now with the card in my hand and Patricia's words still present in the room. Russell had been testing whether Eleanor could be moved, whether her instinct to protect the farm's finances could be overridden by his persuasion or by the pressure of family obligation. And Eleanor, who understood load-bearing structures as well as I did, even if she used different words for them, had recognized a test when she saw one. She had said no, and then she had started walking longer in the evenings. There was the will, though. 8 months before she died, Eleanor had told me she wanted to update her estate documents. Routine, she said, a matter of making sure everything was current. I had gone with her to the attorney's office in Harrisonburg, sat in the waiting room with a cup of terrible coffee while she met with the lawyer privately, and she had come out 40 minutes later with a folder under her arm and the look of someone who had accomplished something necessary. She had never shown me the updated documents. He had not asked. In 41 years of marriage, we had maintained certain boundaries of privacy that were not about distrust but about respect. There were things Eleanor managed, things I managed, and we did not require each other to account for every decision. He had trusted her judgment completely. He still did. You were protecting me, I said, to the dark room, to the ceiling tile, to the four walls that held nothing of her except the lavender that had faded now to the edge of imagining. My voice came out rough and torn at the edges, the voice of a man talking to someone he couldn't stop. He lay in the dark with the card pressed against my chest, and I did not sleep. The monitor beside me tracked my heartbeat with its patient, mechanical rhythm, and I listened to it the way a man listens to something that has become familiar in a short time. The way you listen to the sound of your own breathing when you are trying to stay calm in a situation that does not deserve calm. The card was thick paper, the kind that does not bend easily. I had memorized the 12 digits on the front within minutes of Patricia's departure, repeating them silently until they became part of me. 3 groups of 4. A verification code, she had said. Something Conrad Briggs would recognize as proof that I was me and not someone claiming to be me. Eleanor had been thorough. She had been thorough in ways I was only beginning to understand. He thought about what Patricia had told me. Conrad Briggs had been working on my behalf for 3 years. 3 years. That meant he had started before Eleanor died. Before she was even sick, or at least before she had told me she was sick. He ran through the timeline in my head, counting backward from the date of her death. She had been diagnosed 18 months before she passed. She had told me she wanted to update her estate documents 8 months before she died. She had started walking longer in the evenings 2 years before she died. The pieces were there, scattered across the last years of her life, and I had not seen them because I had not been looking. He had been looking at her face. He had been looking at her hands. He had been looking at the way she moved through the kitchen and the way she laughed at my jokes and the way she pressed her hand against my jaw when she wanted me to really listen. He had been looking at all the things that mattered, and I had missed the things that were happening beneath them. The quiet planning. The careful preparation. The slow, deliberate construction of a defense against a threat she had not yet told me existed. He pressed the card harder against my chest. The edges of it dug into my skin through the thin fabric of the hospital gown, and the small pain of it was grounding. Real. Something I could hold on to in a room that had become full of things that were not real. The false diagnosis. The fraudulent evaluation. The daughter who cried without tears and the son who smiled at his own reflection in a window while his father lay in a hospital bed with broken ribs and a broken heart. The ribs. I shifted slightly, testing the limits of the pain, and found that it had not lessened. If anything, it had settled into something deeper, more permanent. The kind of pain that becomes part of the landscape of the body rather than an intruder upon it. He had known that kind of pain before. He had known it on construction sites when I was young and foolish and thought I was invincible. He had known it in the weeks after Eleanor died, when grief had settled into my chest like a second set of bones that did not fit properly. He knew it now. And I knew that I could live with it. The question was whether I could live with what I had learned tonight. My son and daughter had planned this. They had planned to take everything I had built, everything Eleanor and I had built together, and they had done it with the same careful attention to detail that I had once admired in Russell when he was a boy. He had always been good at planning. He had always been good at seeing the steps ahead and arranging them in the right order. He had thought it was intelligence. He had thought it was ambition. He had thought it was the kind of drive that would serve him well in the world. He had been wrong. The rage came again, rising from somewhere deep in my chest, separate from the pain of the ribs and larger than it. Not the hot, explosive rage of a young man. Something older and colder and more patient. The rage of a man who has been betrayed by the people he trusted most. The rage of a man who has spent 3 years grieving a wife who was taken from him by the very children she had loved and raised and protected. The rage of a man who is still alive and still has work to do. He breathed through it. The way you breathe through anything when you have no choice. One inhale, careful and controlled. One exhale, deliberate and slow. He let the rage settle into something I could use. Something that would not burn me from the inside but would keep me warm in the cold nights ahead. Eleanor had not spent 2 years preparing for this so that I could fall apart now. She had spent 2 years preparing for this because she knew I would not fall apart. She had believed in me, the way she had always believed in me, and I would not make a liar of her. The card. He pulled it out from beneath my shirt and held it up in the dim light of the monitoring equipment. The numbers were clear, written in ink that had not faded in 3 years. He turned it over and looked at the words on the back. Chose 10. The handwriting was unmistakable. Eleanor had always written her letters with a slight upward tilt, the way you write when you are optimistic about what you are saying. She had written these words in that same optimistic hand, even though the content of them was anything but optimistic. She had written them knowing that I would be reading them in a moment like this. Knowing that I would need to see her handwriting, to touch the paper she had touched, to feel the presence of her in the room even when she was not there. He pressed the card back against my chest and closed my eyes. Holt seated the window. The sky had begun its slow shift from black to the deep gray blue that comes an hour before sunrise in the mountains. The thinking hour, Eleanor had called it. The only time of day when the world was quiet enough to hear itself. He had never been awake for the thinking hour. Eleanor had always been awake for it. She had been awake for it for 2 years, planning this. He thought about what she must have felt. The loneliness of it. The weight of carrying something so heavy and not being able to share it. She had walked those evening walks alone, with the knowledge that her children were planning to take everything she loved, and she had not told me. She had protected me from the knowledge for as long as she could. She had let me keep my belief in Russell and Diane, even as she worked to build a defense against them. She had carried that burden alone, because she had not wanted me to carry it with her. He had spent 3 years grieving her. 3 years thinking about what I had lost. 3 years wishing I could have done more, said more, been more present in her final days. And now I understood that she had been present for me in ways I had not known. She had been working for me, planning for me, protecting me, even as her body was failing her. She had been walking those long walks not just to think, but to plan. Not just to grieve her own life, but to make sure that my life would continue after hers ended. I opened my eyes. The sky outside was lighter now, the ridgeline beginning to emerge from the dark. The Blue Ridge, solid and unchanged. The same mountains I had looked at for 40 years. The same mountains Eleanor had looked at on her evening walks. The mountains that had held all of our secrets and all of our plans and all of the things we had built together. He was still holding the card. He had not let go of it all night, and I did not plan to let go of it now. It was the first piece of the puzzle. The first step in the plan Eleanor had set in motion. Conrad Briggs. He did not know him. He had never heard his name before last night. But Eleanor had trusted him. She had written it on the back of this card, in her own hand, with her own ink. Chose 10. That was enough for me. The world began to stir around me. The first sounds of the morning shift. Carts moving in the hallway. Voices, low and professional. The soft beeping of monitors in other rooms. I lay still and let the sounds wash over me, and I held the card against my chest, and I thought about what I needed to do next. I needed to find a way to contact Conrad Briggs. I needed to get out of this room, or at least to a place where I could make a phone call without being overheard. I needed to keep the performance going, to maintain the vacancy and the slackness that had served me so well for 2 days. I needed to be patient and careful and smart. I needed to be the man Eleanor had believed I was. The door opened at 7:15, and a nurse I did not recognize came in with a tray of breakfast. She set it on the table beside my bed and adjusted my pillows with the efficient, impersonal touch of someone who has done the same task 1,000 times. She checked my vitals and made a note on her tablet and moved toward the door without speaking more than a few professional words. I watched her go through as I kept carefully soft and unfocused. I did not move my hands from beneath the blanket. I did not allow any expression to cross my face. The performance was automatic now. Second nature. I had worn it for 2 days, and it had become the shape of me in this place. The breakfast tray sat untouched. The food was hospital food, which meant it was not food at all. But I made myself take a few bites, because I needed the strength. I needed my body to hold up under whatever was coming. I needed to survive the next 12 days, and that meant eating when I could eat and sleeping when I could sleep and doing everything I could to keep the machine of my body running. I was still holding the card. I had tucked it back into my shirt pocket after Patricia left, and now I reached up and touched it through the fabric. The small, hard rectangle of paper. The 12 digits. The 3 words. Chose 10. Eleanor's handwriting, pressed into paper that she had touched 3 years ago, the same hands that had touched my face and held my hand and built a life with me. The same hands that had planned all of this while I slept beside her in the dark. My eyes burned. He pressed them shut and held them shut until the burning steadied. He could not afford to lose myself to grief. Not now. Not yet. He could grieve later, when this was over. He could let myself fall apart when I was safe and the farm was safe and Eleanor's plan had been completed. But that was not now. Now I needed to be hard and focused and clear. He needed to be the man Eleanor had prepared for. He ate more of the breakfast. He drank the orange juice, which was not really orange juice but something that pretended to be. He ate the toast, which was dry and tasteless and required more effort to swallow than it should have. He did not finish any of it, but I ate enough to feel something in my stomach besides the cold emptiness of fear. The morning passed slowly. Bruxelles came at ease with the woman from the day before, the one with the leather portfolio. They did not stay long. They stood at the foot of my bed and spoke in low voices, and I watched them through my empty eyes and listened to every word. They were talking about the papers, the power of attorney, the guardianship, the hearing in 12 days. They were talking about the farm. 20 acres, the woman said. The buyer is prepared to move quickly once the conservatorship is in place. It's been waiting for months. Months, Russell repeated. There was satisfaction in his voice. The satisfaction of a man who has been waiting for something and knows it is almost within reach. He won't have to wait much longer. He kept my face empty. He kept my hands still beneath the blanket. He kept my breathing slow and even. But inside, something cold was building. Something that had nothing to do with the pain in my ribs or the fog of the medication. Something that was pure and sharp and focused, the way steel is focused when it has been sharpened to a point. Months. The buyer had been waiting for months. Bruxelles had been planning this for months. He had not simply reacted to my accident. He had been preparing for it, or something like it, for longer than I wanted to think about. The truck on the road had been arranged. The doctor had been paid. The papers had been filed. Everything had been set in motion before I ever set foot on that gravel road. He thought about Eleanor. I thought about her walking the evening walks, knowing what Russell was planning, knowing that she could not stop him directly but could prepare a defense. She had been building her own plan while Russell had been building his. She had been working with Conrad Briggs while Russell had been working with Dr. Cho. She had been thinking of everything, and she had been thinking of me. The woman with the portfolio opened her case and produced a document. He recognized it from the day before. The emergency power of attorney. She placed it on the tray table and smoothed the pages with her palm, the way you smooth a tablecloth before setting the table. Mr. Holt, she said in the tone people use with the very elderly or the very confused. This is the document we discussed yesterday. It authorizes your son Russell to manage your financial affairs and property during your recovery. We just need your thumbprint on the signature line. Bruxelles came to the side of the bed. He reached for my right hand with both of his, one beneath my palm, one on top. The gesture of a man helping someone who cannot manage alone. His hands were warm and dry and completely steady. The hands of a man who was not afraid of what he was doing. There you go, Dad, he said softly. Easy does it. He guided my hand toward the document. He let him. He let my arm be a passive thing going where he directed it. My face maintaining the slack vacancy I had built over 2 days of careful practice. The woman leaned forward with a stamp pad. The notary positioned himself to witness. And then, in the half second before my thumb touched the page, I pressed the nail of my index finger into the center of my own palm. Hard. Harder than I intended. Hard enough that I felt the edge of it cut a small, bright pain, entirely distinct from the dull grinding of my ribs. Deliberate. Specific. A mark I was making on myself, with full understanding of why I was making it. In Virginia, a signature or mark obtained through physical coercion can be challenged as evidence of duress. A mark left on the skin by the signer at the moment of signing, documented by a medical professional who examines the hand, is behavioral evidence. It is not a guarantee, but combined with the recording of the conversation that had produced it, it was the beginning of an argument. Conrad Briggs would know what to do with the beginning of an argument. Eleanor had trusted him to know. My thumb touched the page. At the same moment, with a movement so small it required nothing more than the shift of weight that came naturally from being guided forward, my right heel pressed back against the footrest of the wheelchair beside the bed. Patricia had positioned it flush against the mattresses that morning during vitals, close enough that my foot reached it without any visible shift in my body. 1 second. 2. 3. A sound like nothing, less than a click, less than a breath. The device activating Russell lifted my hand away from the document with the gentleness of someone handling something fragile. There we go, he said. All done, Al. You did great. The praise landed on me like something physical. You did great. The words a parent says to a small child who has accomplished something beyond their capacity. It was speaking to me from the future he had already built in his head. A future in which I was diminished and manageable and safely out of the way, and everything I had spent 40 years building with Eleanor was being transferred piece by piece into hands that had never done an honest day's work on that land. My jaw tightened. He smoothed it before anyone could notice. The woman was already closing her briefcase, the document inside, the transaction complete as far as she was concerned. The notary affixed his seal with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had stamped a great many documents and thought carefully about very few of them. Roussel signed something on a second page and initialed a third, and the whole thing was done in under 8 minutes. 8 minutes. 40 years against 8 minutes. The door had barely closed behind them when Patricia came in for the morning vitals check. She moved to the monitor, then to the 4-line, then to the wheelchair, adjusting the footrest back to its default position with a motion so practiced it looked like routine. Her eyes did not meet mine. But when she lifted my right hand to check the pulse at my wrist, her fingers turned my palm upward for a moment, and I felt the small, deliberate pressure of her thumb against the mark I had made. Confirming it. Registering it. And then returning my hand to the blanket with the unhurried care of a woman taking a pulse and nothing more. She made a note on the tablet. Blood pressure is a little elevated, she said to the room in general, the way nurses speak when they are addressing the chart rather than the patient. Understandable given the circumstances. Then she walked to the door and paused with her back to me, the same way she had the night before, and said in a voice just slightly lower than her clinical register, Dr. Stowe will be in this evening for a consultation. She's been asked to provide a second opinion on the neurological findings. A beat. A standard procedure when a patient's family has requested conservatorship proceedings. The court requires an independent evaluation. She walked out. I lay in my bed with my right palm closed around the small pane of the mark I had made, and for the first time since I had heard Russell's voice through the gap beneath the door 2 nights ago, I felt something shift in the architecture of the situation. Not much. Not enough to call hope, not yet. But the beginning of something. The beginning of a counterweight. Outside my window, the Blue Ridge sat in the mid-morning light, solid and indifferent and unchanged, and I breathed through my ribs and I thought about load-bearing structures and I waited for evening. Dr. Miriam Stowe arrived at 7:15 that evening. She was not what I expected. He had been prepared for someone older, more clinical, more distant. The kind of doctor who had seen so many cases of neurological damage that she had become inured to the human beings behind them. Doctor. Stop was none of those things. She was maybe 50, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical knot and eyes that were sharp and present and absolutely clear. She moved through the room with the quiet confidence of someone who had been doing this long enough to trust her own judgment, and she looked at me with the direct, assessing gaze of someone who was making up her own mind about what she saw. Mr. Holt, she said. I'm Dr. Miriam Stowe. I'm a neurologist at the University of Virginia Medical Center. I've been asked to perform an independent evaluation of your neurological status by the guardian ad litem appointed to your case. She paused. The court requires an independent medical opinion before any conservatorship proceeding can move forward. That's standard Virginia procedure. It exists specifically to protect people in your situation. He held her gaze. And then slowly, deliberately, I let the vacancy drain out of my eyes. Dr. Stowe's expression did not change. But something in her stillness shifted. A physician's recognition. The moment of contact when the person behind the patient becomes visible. Conrad Briggs, I said. My voice was low and rough but steady. She gave a single nod. He arranged the consultation. He reviewed your file before coming. A brief pause. Doctor. Shaw's evaluation is not consistent with any presentation I have seen in 20 years of neurology. He wanted to see for myself. She produced a consent form from her tablet case and held it out to me, not handing it over, holding it so I could read it clearly. This authorizes the independent examination. Patricia Lane has agreed to witness your signature. Sis outside. Patricia came in quietly, stood at the foot of the bed, and I signed the form with a hand that was steadier than I expected. My own signature. Unambiguous. Nothing like the slack thumbprint Russell had guided onto the POI 8 days ago. Dr. Stowe worked efficiently and without theater. Cognitive assessment first. Orientation questions. Memory sequences. Pattern recognition. He answered everything cleanly, quickly, without hesitation. She tested my reflexes, tracked my movements, asked me to describe the last book I had read, and the name of the county seat of Rockingham County, and the year I had retired. Harrisonburg. 2014, she made notes after each response, her stylus moving across the tablet with the focused economy of someone building a record rather than taking casual observations. Tell me what happened, she said when the formal testing was done. In your own words. So I told her. I love it. The truck on the road. Russell's smile in the window. The poa. The recording. The car. Eleanor. He kept my voice low and even, and I did not rush, because rushing was for people who were afraid their story would be taken away before they finished it. Dr. Stowe listened without interrupting. Her eyes on my face, the tablet dark in her lap. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. The guardian ad litem has already flagged inconsistencies in Dr. Shaw's evaluation, she said finally. My findings will be filed with the court by Thursday morning. She looked at me steadily. You have 8 days until the hearing, Mr. Holt. Conrad Briggs will contact you tomorrow. She closed the tablet case and stood. For what it's worth, Dr. Stowe said at the door, Eleanor chose her team carefully. She left. Patricia followed, pulling the curtain back into place as she went, leaving the room exactly as it had been, except that somewhere in the court system of Rockingham County, a second medical opinion was now traveling toward a judge's desk, and it said something entirely different from what Dr. Shaw had been paid to say. I lay in the dark and felt for the first time that the ground beneath me was something other than empty air. Outside, the night nurses moved through their rounds. The monitor tracked my heartbeat. And 8 days suddenly felt like enough. I waited until those in the morning. Until the ward had gone fully quiet. Until the last set of footsteps had passed my door and not returned. Until the only sounds were the monitor and the ventilation system and the particular deep silence of a building that has finally stopped pretending it is anything other than a place where people wait. Then I reached beneath the blanket and I took out Eleanor's Bible. The envelope was exactly where my fingers had found it 4 days ago, pressed flat into the gap between the end paper and the back cover, invisible unless you were looking for it. I worked it free carefully, one corner at a time, and held it in the low light of the monitoring equipment. My name on the front. Her handwriting. The letters slightly larger than her usual script, as if she had wanted to make sure, across whatever distance separated the writing from the reading, that I would know this was meant for me. My hands were trembling. Not from pain. From the simple, devastating fact of holding something she had touched. I opened it. Walter, if you're reading this, then what I was afraid of has happened, and I'm sorry I couldn't be there to face it with you. I'm sorry for a lot of things. Mostly, I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I started noticing things about Russell and Diane 2 years before I got sick. Small things first. The way Russell looked at the East Acreage when he thought I wasn't watching. The questions Diane asked about the life insurance that weren't really questions about the insurance. I told myself I was wrong. I wanted to be wrong. You love them so much, Walter. And I didn't want to be the one to change the way you looked at them. But I wasn't wrong. I hired Conrad Briggs 18 months before I passed. He's a good man. Careful. Honest. The kind of person who understands that some jobs matter more than others. I gave him everything I had. He also signed a legal authorization allowing him access to my medical records and pharmacy files going back 5 years. And I asked the pharmacy to retain my prescription records under a preservation clause Conrad filed on my behalf. He did this because I needed there to be a record of everything. Walter, my heart medication was changed. I don't know exactly when or how, but Conrad found the discrepancy in the pharmacy records. The prescription on file does not match what I was actually given. I can't prove who did it, but Conrad can follow it further than I could. I need you to let him. The farm is yours. He made sure of it. Everything I updated in the will 2 years ago was done to protect what we built together. Russell and Diane will find that the walls are stronger than they look. I love you. I have loved you for 41 years and I will love you for whatever comes after that. I'm sorry I couldn't stay. Trust Conrad. Trust yourself. Come home. Eleanor. I read it twice. Then I folded it along the original creases, her creases, the ones she had made when she sealed it. And I pressed it flat against my chest over the place where her name had lived for 3 years like a wound that wouldn't close. My face was wet. He hadn't noticed when that started. He did not try to stop it. There was no one to perform for. Just me and Eleanor's words and the dark room and the monitor that kept faithfully reporting that I was still here. My heart medication was changed. The words sat in my chest alongside the grief, distinct from it, colder. Russell and Diane had not simply decided to take the farm after Eleanor died. They had decided before. They had looked at their mother and seen an obstacle, and they had removed her, and then they had waited 3 years with the patience of people who believed they had already won. Eleanor had known. She had known, and she had been gathering evidence, and she had been dying at the same time. And she had not told me because she had not wanted me to know what our children were while she was still alive to see my face when I found out. The grief cracked open then, fully and without warning, a sound coming out of me that I had no name for. Not a sob. Something older and more fundamental than that. The sound of a structure giving way under a load it was never designed to carry. He pressed the letter harder against my chest, and I breathed through it one ragged inhale at a time until the shaking slowed and the sound stopped, and what was left was something quieter and more permanent than grief. Resab. The kind that doesn't burn hot. The kind that simply stays. Come home, she had written. I'm coming, I told the dark room. I promise. I arrived at 8:15 the next morning while the breakfast cart was still moving through the ward. I heard the conversation at the nurse's station before I saw him. A voice I didn't recognize, calm and unhurried, explaining to someone that he was the legal representative of record for Walter Holt, that the guardian ad litem appointed by Rockingham County Circuit Court had notified the hospital of his access authorization, and that he would need 5 minutes with his client. The voice of a man who had said this particular sentence before and knew exactly which words carried weight. It came through the door a minute later. Conrad Briggs was 58 years old and looked like a man who had spent those years doing work that required paying close attention to things other people preferred not to examine. Medium height. Gray at the temples. A sport coat that fit well without trying to impress anyone. He carried a leather folder and a paper cup of coffee from the hospital cafeteria, and he looked at me with the direct, assessing gaze of someone who already knew the answer to the question he was about to ask. Mr. Holt. He pulled the chair close to the bed and sat down, setting the coffee on the tray table. Eleanor told me you'd be the most stubborn patient I'd ever have to deal with. My throat tightened so fast it almost hurt. She wasn't wrong, I managed. Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something more durable than that. No, he said. She rarely was. He opened the folder and got straight to it, because Conrad Briggs was, I would learn, a man who understood that sentiment and efficiency were not enemies, but that in rooms like this one, efficiency came first. Eleanor had found him 3 years ago through a retired Virginia State Police investigator she'd met at a community legal aid event in Harrisonburg. She had walked into his office with a list of specific concerns about Russell and Diane and a willingness to fund a thorough investigation. And Conrad had spent 18 months following the money before Eleanor died and another 18 months after, because she had paid him through the foundation she had established specifically for that purpose, and the work was not finished. What do we have? He asked. Conrad set 3 items on the tray table. First, Dr. Stowe's evaluation was filed with the court this morning. It directly contradicts Shaw's findings. The guardian ad litem has flagged Shaw's evaluation for review. He tapped the first page. Second, the recording from your room. He had it transferred and authenticated yesterday. Under Virginia Code February 1962, one-party consent, it is fully admissible. Russell and Diane gave us everything we needed in under 12 minutes. And the pharmacy records? He asked. Eleanor's prescription. Conrad's jaw tightened slightly. The first crack in his composure. The records show a dosage modification logged 11 days before Eleanor's cardiac event. The pharmacist who processed it has since left the state. We have the paper trail. We have the timing. What we don't have yet is a direct link to Russell or Diane, but the circumstantial case is strong enough that the DS office will want to look at it. It met my eyes. That conversation happens after the conservatorship hearing. One thing at a time. The camera footage, I said. The intersection. Preservation order went in the day you were admitted. We have the footage. The vehicle is registered to a man named Dale Whitson, Russell's college roommate. Beatson has a record. AAG talk. He lay back against the pillow and let out a breath that had been building for 8 days. The hearing is in 6 days, Conrad said. I need you to do exactly what you've been doing. Nothing. Stay in this bed. Keep the performance going, and let me work. A pause. Lou Granger brought your suit. It's in the closet. My suit. Dark charcoal. The one Eleanor had picked out for our youngest grandson's christening 4 years ago. She had said it made me look like a man who knew what he was worth. One more thing, Conrad said, closing the folder. Eleanor left a letter for the court. Separate from what she left for you. It details everything she observed, everything she documented, everything she feared. He looked at me steadily. She wrote it 8 months before she died. She notarized it. It is legally admissible as a declaration against interest. A pause. She thought of everything, M.R. Holt. My eyes burned. He pressed them shut for 1 second, then opened them. Yes, I said. She did. Conrad stood, picked up the folder, and left the coffee on my tray table. At the door, he paused the way Patricia always paused. Something about this case I was beginning to understand attracted people who communicated most clearly from doorways. 6 days, he said. Rest up. The door closed. He reached for the coffee. Hospital Cafeteria. Bitter and slightly stale. The worst coffee I had ever tasted. And I drank it like it was the finest thing I'd been offered in a week. Maybe it was. 2 days passed quietly. Quietly on the surface, anyway. He had learned by then that quiet in this hospital meant different things depending on which side of the door you were on. On my side, the performance continued. Soft eyes. Slack jaw. The occasional slow blink that said nobody was home. Russell came one Sunday night, stayed 20 minutes, talked at me about nothing, while his eyes moved around the room the way eyes move when they're looking for something specific without wanting to be seen looking. He gave him nothing. He left with the careful neutrality of a man who had not yet found what was bothering him but knew something was bothering him. On day 10, he found it. He heard him at the nurse's station before I heard him at my door. And this time, the voice was different. The all-on-water smoothness was gone. What was underneath it was not quite anger but its functional equivalent, a cold, clipped precision that belonged to a man who had just discovered that the room he thought he controlled had another door in it. I was not informed, Russell said, that a legal representative had been granted access to my father. The nurse's response was calm and professional. The Guardian ad litem filing, she explained, had been submitted directly through the court system under emergency seal. A standard procedure when there was reason to believe a respondent's access to counsel might be interfered with. The hospital had been notified through official channels, not through the family. Betrayal had not been on that notification list. It was the standard language of an institution that had followed proper procedure and knew it. Betrayal had simply not been watching the right door. Betrayal's voice dropped lower. I want to know who authorized this. The court, Mr. Holt. It's standard procedure in conservatorship proceedings. I paused long enough that I could picture him recalibrating, the way a man recalibrates when the ground shifts under him, and he needs a moment to find his footing before he starts moving again. It came into my room 2 minutes later. It didn't look at me immediately. He stood at the window with his back to the bed, one hand in his pocket, the other pressed flat against the glass, and he looked out at the Blue Ridge with an expression I couldn't fully read from where I lay. Something tighter than what he usually showed. Something with edges. Then he turned. Dad. The softness was back, applied deliberately, like a coat of paint over something rough. How are you feeling today? I looked at him with my empty eyes and said nothing. Betrayal pulled the chair close and sat down and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and for a long moment he looked at me with an expression that I realized, with a chill that had nothing to do with the room temperature, was genuinely trying to read me. To see if there was something behind the vacancy that hadn't been there before. He gave him the vacancy. Full and complete and utterly convincing. He hoped. I don't know what you think you're doing, old man, he said quietly. His voice was almost gentle, which was worse than if it had been hard. But whatever it is, it won't work. Sub's evaluation is on file. The POA is executed. In 5 days, this is done. It paused. I'd like you to come through this with some dignity. He really would. The word dignity in his mouth made something hot move through my chest. He breathed through it and kept my face still. Betrayal stood up and straightened his jacket. It was moving toward the door when his phone rang. He glanced at it and something in his expression shifted. He stepped into the hallway, pulling the door most of the way closed behind him, and I heard fragments. Transfer order signed by Shaw. Tomorrow morning before the hearing. Stanton can take him by noon. They were moving me tomorrow. Before the hearing. Before Conrad could do anything about it. My heart rate spiked. The monitor registered it, a brief, urgent cluster of tones, and I pressed my heel against the footrest once quickly because I needed to think, and the thinking had to happen now. 40 minutes later, Patricia came in for afternoon vitals. She checked the monitor, adjusted the form, and as she reached past me to note something on the chart, she said very quietly and without looking at me, Mr. Briggs filed an emergency motion to stay with Rockingham County Circuit Court 40 minutes ago. Holt Callum has issued a temporary hold on any patient transfer pending the hearing. Dr. Shaw's transfer order is suspended. She straightened up and made her notation and moved toward the door. The hearing is in 5 days, Mr. Holt, she said in her normal clinical register. Try to rest. She left. He lay in the bed and let the relief move through me the way relief moves when it arrives after a long time of holding something very heavy. Not the release exactly. A lightening. The sensation of a load redistributing across a broader set of supports. Conrad had filed before Russell could act. Holt Callum had moved fast. Faster than Russell had anticipated. Faster than anyone who believed the case was already decided would have expected a judge to move. Which meant Judge Callum had read what Conrad filed and found it worth taking seriously. That evening, Russell came back one final time. He stood in the doorway rather than entering, and he looked at me in the bed, and his face had gone through whatever it goes through when a man realizes the situation is no longer entirely his. "Rest up, Dad," he said. His voice was steady. "He says we're not." He left without closing the door, and I listened to his footsteps move down the hallway and turn the corner and disappear. And I thought about Eleanor's walls. The ones she had said were stronger than they looked. She had been right about that, though. The 4 days between Russell's last visit and the night before the hearing passed the way the final days of a long siege pass. Not quickly. Not slowly. With a particular quality of suspended time that belongs to waiting. You cannot rush it. Conrad came once more briefly to confirm the filing schedule and review the sequence of evidence he intended to present. The night before the hearing, I could not sleep. The ward was quiet. The Blue Ridge outside my window had gone fully dark, just a suggestion of mass against the night sky. The ridgeline I had lived beside for 40 years, rendered invisible by the dark and present anyway. The way certain things remain present even when you can't see them. I took Eleanor's letter from my shirt pocket. He had read it so many times in the past week that I no longer needed the light to follow it. My fingers knew the fold, the slight thickening where her pen had pressed harder on certain words, the smooth patch near the bottom where she had rested her palm while the ink dried. He held it open anyway in the faint glow of the monitor because holding it was different from remembering it. "Come home," she had written. "I'm trying," I told her. My voice came out rough and low, scraped down to something honest. "Tomato. I'm trying." The monitor tracked my heartbeat. The ventilation hung. Outside, somewhere on the ward, a cart moved and stopped and moved again. He thought about what I was afraid of, not losing the farm. Or not only that. What I was afraid of, if I was honest in the way that those in the morning demands honesty, was standing up in that courtroom and finding that I wasn't enough. That 72 years and 2 broken ribs and 14 days in a hospital bed had taken something from me that I needed to have tomorrow. That when the moment came, I would reach for whatever it was that had carried me through 40 years of hard work and one catastrophic loss and find the shelf empty. Eleanor had believed in Conrad. Conrad had believed in the evidence. And somewhere beneath both of those, Eleanor had believed in me. Had written "trust yourself" in the same sentence as "trust Conrad." As if the two were equal weights on the same scale. The phone at the nurse's station rang. A minute later, a soft knock at my door. The night nurse, a young man named Derek who had been quietly kind in the way of someone who understood that kindness at those in the morning is a different thing than kindness at noon, leaned in and said, "Mr. Holt, there's a call for you." Guy says his name is Lou. My chest tightened and loosened in the same breath. Derek handed me the receiver and stepped back to give me what privacy a hospital room allows, which is not much but is something. "Lou," I said. "Walter." His voice came through the line the way Lou's voice always came through things. Solid. Unurried. Built to last. "How are you holding up?" "I've had better 2 weeks." A short sound that was as close to a laugh as Lou got when things weren't fully funny. "I imagine you have." A pause. "I've been thinking about you all day." Drove out to the farm this afternoon just to check on things. The lavender's still coming up along the south fence. My throat tightened. He pressed my fist against my sternum and held it there. Eleanor planted that, I said. I know she did. Lou's voice was quieter now, carrying something he wasn't going to name directly because Lou Granger never named things directly if he could help it. It's tough as hell. Comes back every year no matter what. We were not talking about lavender. I'll be there tomorrow, Lou said. Front row. You won't see an empty seat next to me because I'm going to be the one filling it. I beat. Conrad called me yesterday. Told me what you've been doing in there these past 2 weeks. Another pause, heavier than the others. Walter, Eleanor would be, she'd be something watching you do this. The tears came without warning, fast and without theater. The way emotion arrives when you've stopped bracing against it. He pressed my fist harder against my chest and breathed through it. She started it, I said when I could. I'm just finishing what she started. That's the whole thing right there, Lou said. That's all it ever is. We stayed on the line for another minute without saying much. The comfortable silence of two men who have known each other long enough that presence counts for more than words. Then Lou said he'd see me in the morning, and I handed the receiver back to Derek, and I lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling. The fear was still there, but it had shifted. Moved it from the center of my chest to somewhere more peripheral, where it could be acknowledged without being in charge. He folded Eleanor's letter along her creases one last time and pressed it flat against my heart. The charcoal suit was hanging in the closet. Conrad had the evidence. Lou had the front row. He closed my eyes. Come home, she had written. Tomato, I thought. Tomato, I come home. Rockingham County Circuit Court sat on the corner of German Street and Court Square in Harrisonburg, a brick building from another century that smelled of old wood and floor wax and the particular density of air that accumulates in rooms where consequential things have been decided for a long time. He had driven past it 100 times in 40 years. He had never been inside. They brought me in through a side entrance in the wheelchair, which Russell had arranged on the grounds that my condition made the main entrance steps impractical. He let him arrange it. He let him arrange everything this last morning because the performance had to hold for another hour, and then it would not matter anymore. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Wood paneling. Fluorescent lighting softened by age. 3 rows of public gallery benches that were mostly empty at 9:00 in the morning. A clerk at a small desk to the left of the bench. The Virginia state seal on the wall behind the judge's chair, slightly off-center, the kind of detail that accumulates in old buildings when no one has bothered to fix it for decades. Lou was in the front row. Dark suit. Blue tie. Shoes polished to a mirror finish, the way men of Lou's generation polish shoes when something mattered. He was sitting with his hands folded in his lap and his back straight. And when the aide wheeled me to the respondent's table, he turned his head and found me immediately. It did not wave. It did not mouth anything. It just looked at me with the steady, unhurried certainty of a man who had driven 40 minutos on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks ago because nobody was answering the phone, and who had not stopped showing up since. He looked back at him for 1 second. Then I let my eyes go soft and I looked at the table. Russell and Diane were already seated at the petitioner's table with their attorney, a man in his 50s named Greer who had the well-fed look of a lawyer whose clients usually won. Russell was in a charcoal suit that cost more than mine. Diane had her hair pulled back severely the way she wore it when she wanted to project seriousness. She had been crying, or had arranged her face to suggest she had been. Her eyes were reddened at the corners in a way that was very convincing if you didn't know that Eleanor, when she actually cried, didn't look like that at all. Judge Howard Callum entered at 9:02, and the clerk called the room to order, and everyone sat, and the hearing began. Greer was good. He would give him that. He laid out the petitioner's case with the measured, sorrowful efficiency of a man who had done this before and understood that judges responded better to quiet grief than to dramatics. He spoke about my accident, my prognosis, my inability to manage my own affairs. He used the word vulnerable 4 times in 8 minutes. He spoke about the farm. A significant asset requiring active management, he said, which a man in Mr. Holt's condition cannot provide. He did not look at me while he said any of this. I was the subject of the proceeding, not a participant in it. That was exactly what Russell had intended when he'd arranged the emergency conservatorship. To transform me from a person withstanding into a problem requiring management. Dr. Shaw's evaluation was entered into evidence. The clerk confirmed the document number. Judge Callum reviewed it with the focused attention of a man who read a great many documents and could assess them quickly. Then Greer produced the power of attorney. Your Honor, he said, Mr. Holt voluntarily executed this document during his hospitalization, authorizing his son Russell Holt to manage his financial affairs. We submit this as evidence of Mr. Holt's awareness that he required assistance, even in his compromised state. Diane made a sound at the petitioner's table. A soft, carefully timed exhalation that landed in the room like a punctuation mark. She pressed her fingers to her lips. Russell reached over and placed his hand on her arm. He watched all of it through eyes that registered nothing. Judge Callum set the POA beside the evaluation and looked at them together for a long moment. Then he looked at me. The verdict, level gaze of a man who had spent 30 years on the bench and had learned to look at respondents in conservatorship hearings the way you look at anyone whose fate you are about to decide. He gave him vacancy. Complete and total and utterly convincing. He reached for the gavel. In the front row, Lou Granger's hands tightened in his lap. He caught it in my peripheral vision. The whitening of the knuckles. The small, involuntary response of a man watching something he cannot stop and cannot look away from. It did not move. It did not make a sound. It just held on. The way Lou held on to everything. With the stubborn, faithful grip of someone who had decided this was worth holding. Judge Callum's hand closed around the gavel. The courtroom door opened. Not loudly. It was a heavy door, and it opened with the controlled authority of someone who had timed their entrance and was not in a hurry now that they had made it. The sound moved through the room the way a change in air pressure moves. Subtle and immediate. Felt before it was understood. Every head turned. He did not turn mine. He did not need to. He had been waiting for this for 14 days, and I knew the footsteps, and I kept my eyes on the judge's gavel, and I breathed through my broken ribs, and I waited for what came next. Conrad Briggs walked into their courtroom the way Eleanor had always walked into a room she had prepared for. Without hurry. Without theater. With the particular unhurried confidence of someone who knows exactly what they're carrying and trusts its weight. He was dressed in a dark suit and carrying a leather folder, and he moved directly to the clerk's desk and presented his credentials without looking at the petitioner's table. The clerk reviewed them, made a note, and Conrad turned to face the bench. Your Honor, Conrad Briggs, legal representative of record for Walter Holt, the respondent in this proceeding. He apologized for the timing of my entry. I wanted to hear the petitioner's full presentation before responding. Judge Callum set the gavel down. He looked at Conrad over the rims of his glasses with the measured expression of a man recalibrating his understanding of what kind of morning this was going to be. Mayor Briggs, he said, you're on the record. At the petitioner's table, Russell had gone very still. The particular stillness of a man who has just seen something enter the room that he had told himself wasn't coming. Conrad set his folder on the respondent's table. He pulled out the chair. And then he looked at me. He put my hands on the armrests of the wheelchair. My ribs had been healing for 15 days. Not healed. Healing. There is a difference that anyone who has broken ribs understands in the specific, unambiguous language of pain. Standing was going to cost me something. He had known that since last night when I had practiced the movement twice in the dark, slowly, to understand what I was asking of myself. He pushed. The first inch was the hardest. The weight transferring from the chair to my arms. My arms pushing against the rests. My legs finding the floor and remembering what they were for. The pain came in a single clean wave across my left side, sharp enough to blur my vision for half a second. And I breathed through it the way I had been breathing through things for 15 days. Deliberately. One breath and then another. Straightened. Not all the way. Not perfectly. He was 72 years old with 2 healing ribs and 15 days of hospital bed behind me, and I was not going to pretend otherwise. But I stood. Both feet on the floor of Rockingham County Circuit Court. Both hands releasing the armrests. My spine finding its full height. For the first time since a blue pickup truck had ended my morning walk on a county road outside Harrisonburg, I reached up and adjusted the collar of my charcoal suit. Then I raised my head. The room had gone completely silent. Not the anticipatory silence of a courtroom waiting for the next procedural step. The arrested silence of a room full of people who have just understood that what they thought was happening is not what is happening. Across the room, Russell Holt's face went through 4 things in the space of 2 seconds. He watched all 4 of them. Disbelief first. The raw, unguarded kind that belongs to the moment before the mind catches up with the eyes. Then something that might, in a different person, have been shame. Then the rapid, visible reconstruction of composure. The practiced reassembly of the man who had been wearing concern and grief like a tailored suit for 15 days. And beneath all of it, last and most honest, fear. Not of me. Of what came next. Diane made a sound. A short, involuntary intake of breath that was nothing like the careful performance of anguish she had been delivering since I arrived. It was the sound a person makes when something they didn't actively believe could happen has just happened in front of them. Your Honor, Conrad said into the silence, I'd like to submit the respondent's first piece of evidence. He placed a document on the clerk's desk. Dr. Stowe's evaluation. 23 pages. Filed with the court on Thursday, as she promised. This is an independent neurological evaluation of Walter Holt conducted by Dr. Miriam Stowe of the University of Virginia Medical Center on day 6 of Mr. Holt's hospitalization, at the request of the guardian ad litem appointed to this case. Conrad opened to a marked page and read clearly and without dramatic inflection because the words did not need help. Mr. Holt demonstrates full orientation to person, place, time, and circumstance. Cognitive assessment reveals no impairment in executive function, working memory, or decision-making capacity. The neurological findings documented in the prior evaluation are not consistent with any presentation observed during this examination or supported by the imaging reviewed. I set the document down. Judge Callum had taken off his glasses and was looking at Dr. Shaw's evaluation and Dr. Stowe's evaluation side by side on the bench in front of him with the expression of a man who has just been given two maps of the same territory that do not agree on the location of anything. At the petitioner's table, Dr. Shaw had gone the color of old chalk. Your Honor, Greer said, rising, we would object to the admission of, you'll have your opportunity, Mr. Greer. Judge Callum said with the flat authority of a man who has been on the bench for 30 years and knows exactly when an objection is a delaying tactic. Sit down. Greer sat. Conrad produced a small recording device and set it on the clerk's desk. The respondent's second piece of evidence is an audio recording made on day 5 of Mr. Holt's hospitalization in the respondent's presence, by the respondent, under Virginia Code Section February 1962, which permits one-party consent recording when the recording party is present in the conversation. This recording is fully admissible. It paused. I'd like to play a portion of it for the court. I pressed play. Russell's voice filled the courtroom. Flat. Business-like. Stripped of every ounce of the careful warmth he had performed for 15 days. Talking about the hearing. The nursing home. The farm. The buyer who was already waiting. And then Diane's voice, smaller, tighter. Mom never should have written the will the way she did. And Russell, no. She shouldn't have. The recording ran for 47 seconds. In those 47 seconds, the petitioner's case, which Greer had constructed with such measured, sorrowful care, came apart the way structures come apart when the load-bearing element fails. Not slowly. Not gracefully. All at once. With a finality that left no question about what had been holding everything up. Diana's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat on the table, and they shook anyway. Russell was looking at the table in front of him with the fixed, inward expression of a man running rapid calculations on a situation that had stopped offering good options. Judge Callum set his pen down. Mr. Briggs, he said quietly, you indicated you had additional evidence. 2 more pieces, Your Honor, Conrad said. The most significant of which concerns the circumstances of Eleanor Holt's death in 2021. He opened the second section of his folder. I'd like to address those now. In the front row, Lou Granger had unclasped his hands. He was leaning forward slightly, elbows on his knees. And when I glanced at him, he was already looking at me. Not with triumph. Not with relief. With the expression of a man watching something be said right after a long time of being wrong and finding it almost more than he could hold. He looked back at the bench. He was still standing. Conrad opened the third section of his folder, and the room, which had already gone quiet, went quieter. Your Honor, the third piece of evidence is footage from a traffic camera at the intersection of Route 11 and Crestwood Drive in Rockingham County, recorded at 6:41 in the morning on October the 7th of this year. He handed a USB drive to the clerk. A preservation order was filed with the county the same day. Mr. Holt was admitted to Blue Ridge Regional, ensuring the footage was retained before it could be overwritten. What it shows is a dark blue pickup truck registered to a man named Dale Whitson of Staunton, Virginia, stopping at that intersection, waiting, and then accelerating toward a pedestrian who had not yet entered the crosswalk. Greer was on his feet. Your Honor, the relevance of a traffic incident to a conservatorship proceeding goes directly to the question of whether the circumstances that produced the medical evaluation were themselves manufactured, Conrad said without raising his voice. If the accident was staged, the evaluation that followed it was the intended result, not an incidental finding. Holt Callum looked at Greer. I'll allow it. Sit down, Mr. Greer. The footage played on the laptop the clerk had set up. 23 seconds of grainy morning light and a blue truck that did exactly what Conrad had described. The room watched it in the kind of silence that falls when something that seemed like one thing reveals itself to be another thing entirely. Diane pressed both hands over her mouth. Roussel did not move. He was looking at the screen with the expression of a man watching a controlled demolition, knowing it was coming, unable to stop it, unable to look away. Conrad continued, is currently cooperating with the Rockingham County Sheriff's Office in exchange for consideration in the charging process. His statement, provided 2 days ago, names the individual who contracted him for this task. It did not say the name aloud. It didn't need to. The name was in the folder he handed to the clerk, and it would be in the record, and Russell knew it. For the first time since I had woken up in the ICU 15 days ago, I watched my son's composure fail completely. Not dramatically. Roussel was not a dramatic man. It was quieter than that. His shoulders dropped a single inch. His jaw loosened. It looked suddenly like what he was. A 44-year-old man who had made a series of catastrophic decisions and had just run out of room to outrun them. The fourth piece of evidence, Conrad said, requires some context. He paused, and in that pause, the courtroom door opened again. He turned my head. A woman in scrubs walked in, not hurrying. Not performing. Simply moving through the door with the same quiet efficiency I had felt in the dark of an ICU room 15 days ago. Her hair was down now, not pulled back under a cap. She wasn't wearing a mask. Patricia Lane. I had known her by her hands and her voice and the lavender she had worn to carry Eleanor's message into a hospital room at 2 in the morning. He had known her by her gait and the gentleness and the particular composure that belongs to people who have been afraid and chosen to act anyway. He had not known her face. She was younger than I had imagined. Dark eyes, steady and warm, carrying something that was not quite grief but lived in the same neighborhood. She met my gaze as she walked to the witness stand, and in hers I saw something I recognized. The expression of someone who has been waiting a long time to finish something that needed finishing. Patricia Lane, Conrad said, is a registered nurse at Blue Ridge Regional Medical Center. She has provided a sworn statement regarding the physical evidence documented during Mr. Holt's hospitalization, specifically a mark on Mr. Holt's right palm photographed on day 3, which is consistent with self-inflicted pressure applied during a coerced signing and constitutes behavioral evidence of duress under Virginia case law. It paused. She also has direct knowledge of the circumstances under which the recording was made. Judge Callum nodded. Mississippi Lane, you'll be sworn. While the clerk administered the oath, Conrad turned back to the bench. Your Honor, the fourth and final piece of evidence is a document executed by Eleanor Holt 18 months before her death. A notarized declaration in which she details her observations regarding her prescription medication, her concerns about who had access to her prescriptions, and her instructions to her pharmacy to retain all records under a legal preservation clause with access authorized to Conrad Briggs. He set the document on the clerk's desk. Pharmacy records subpoenaed pursuant to that authorization show a dosage modification to Mrs. Holt's cardiac medication logged 11 days before her death. The modification was not authorized by her physician. The room did not make a sound. Diana's hands came down from her mouth. She was crying now. Not the performance from this morning. Not the careful reddening of the eyes and the timed exhalations. Real crying. The kind that happens when the thing you've been holding collapses under its own weight. Her whole face changed with it. Her chin trembled. Her breath hitched. And she looked, in that moment, nothing like the woman who had sat beside my hospital bed and talked at me about restaurants and weather. She looked like someone who had just understood, fully and finally, what she had done. Russell put his hand on her arm. She pulled away from him. That small movement, Diane pulling away from Russell's hand, was the first honest thing I had seen from either of them in 15 days. Judge Callum removed his glasses and set them on the bench and looked at the petitioner's table for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had the particular quality of a man choosing his words with care because the words were going to matter. I'm suspending this proceeding, he said. The emergency conservatorship petition is denied. I'm referring the matter of the falsified medical evaluation to the Virginia Board of Medicine and to the Rockingham County Commonwealth's attorney. I looked at Conrad. Mayor Briggs, I'd like your fourth exhibit held for the Commonwealth's attorney. This court finds probable cause for a criminal investigation into the circumstances of Eleanor Holt's death. He looked at the deputies standing at the back of the room. He didn't need to say anything else. They came forward quietly. The way things that are inevitable move without drama, without hurry. Russell stood before they reached him. He straightened his jacket. He held out his wrists. He looked at me once just before the cuffs went on. He had thought in the long nights of the past 2 weeks about what I would feel in this moment. He had expected anger. Or something like satisfaction. Or even grief. The grief of watching your son become the thing he had chosen to become. What I felt instead was something quieter and harder to name. Not forgiveness. Not its opposite. Something that existed beyond both of those, in the place where you finally stopped carrying something that was never yours to carry. Eleanor had carried it for 2 years. She had carried it alone in evening walks in attorneys' offices and quiet conversations with a nurse named Patricia and a man named Conrad. And she had never let me see the weight of it because she had not wanted me to know. He had been carrying it for 15 days now. He set it down. The deputies led Russell and Diane out through the side door, and the room breathed again, and Lou Granger stood up in the front row. Not cheering. Not celebrating. Just standing. The way you stand when something has been completed that needed completing. And he looked at me across the courtroom with eyes that were bright and full. Walter, he said. Used my name. Used that. It was enough. The side door of Rockingham County Circuit Court opened onto a small plaza with a maple tree that had gone fully red in the October cold, and the sunlight on that red was the most vivid thing I had seen in 15 days. I walked out on my own feet. Slowly. With one hand on the door frame for the first step. With the broken ribs making their position on the matter very clearly known. But on my own feet. Without the wheelchair. The charcoal suit Eleanor had picked out hanging on a frame that had lost weight but had not lost its essential shape. The air outside smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves and the particular sharpness of a Virginia October that reminds you every year that summer does not actually last forever. And that is never a bad thing. Lou was waiting at the bottom of the steps. He had his hands in his coat pockets and he was looking at the maple tree with the studied casualness of a man who has been standing somewhere for a while and has decided that looking at a tree is better than looking like he's been waiting. When he heard the door, he turned, and his face did something complicated that he smoothed into something simpler before it finished. And he came up 2 steps and put his hand on my arm. Not gripping. Not guiding. Used present. The way Lou had always been present when it mattered. You did it, he said. Eleanor did it, I said. I just showed up. Lou made the sound that was as close to a laugh as he got when things were not fully funny and also not fully not funny. He kept his hand on my arm as we came down the last 2 steps, and at the bottom he stopped and looked at me directly with eyes that were doing the thing they had been doing in the courtroom. Bright and full and working hard to hold what was in them. She'd be proud of you, Walter, he said. I know you know that, but I'm going to say it anyway because some things need to be said out loud. My throat tightened. He pressed my lips together and nodded once, which was all I had. Conrad came through the door a minute later, folder under his arm, moving with the same unhurried efficiency he brought to everything. He came down the steps and extended his hand, and I shook it, and his grip was firm and brief and said everything it needed to say without requiring words. The Commonwealth's attorney will be in touch within the week, he said. Dr. Shaw's license has already been flagged with the Virginia Board of Medicine. Dale Whitson's statement is on record. He reached into the folder and produced a small envelope and a single key. The foundation account Eleanor established. There is a little over $40,000 in it. What she set aside for costs and what remained after my fees. It's yours, Mary Holt. She intended it for whatever you needed next. He took the envelope. It was lighter than it should have been for something that heavy. She thought of everything, I said. She did, Conrad said. And there was something in the way he said it. Not professional satisfaction. Something more personal than that. That told me Eleanor had not just been a client to him. She had been someone he had respected. The way you respect people who do difficult things with full understanding of their difficulty and do them anyway. He shook Lou's hand, nodded to me, and walked toward the parking structure with the purposeful stride of a man who already had the next thing on his mind. Patricia came out last. She had changed out of the scrubs into a jacket and jeans. And in the afternoon light, she looked younger than she had in the courtroom and less formal and more like the person she actually was when she wasn't walking into difficult rooms to do difficult things. She stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked at me with those dark, steady eyes. And for a moment, neither of us said anything because there was too much to say and no good place to start. He started anyway. I didn't know what you looked like, I said. Until today. He knew your hands and your voice and the lavender. He paused. Eleanor chose well. Patricia's eyes filled. She did not look away, and she did not try to stop it. She talked about you constantly, she said. Every time I saw her. Every meeting we had. It came back to you. What you'd built together. What she wanted to protect. Her voice caught slightly, and she steadied it. She said the hardest part wasn't being sick. The hardest part was knowing she was going to have to leave you with something she couldn't fix for you. My chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with broken ribs. She fixed it, I said. You let her, Patricia said. That's not nothing, Mr. Holt. A lot of people wouldn't have trusted it. Wouldn't they have held on long enough? He thought about 14 days of vacancy and performance and pain and the card pressed flat against my chest in the dark. He thought about trust him. A written in a hand I would have known anywhere. She made it easy, I said. She always made everything easier than it should have been. Patricia reached out and pressed my hand once briefly, the way she had pressed it in the dark of the ICU on the first night. Cool and steady and completely without performance. Then she stepped back and smiled. A real smile. The kind that arrives after something has been completed that needed completing. Go home, Mr. Holt, she said. Lou was already at the car holding the passenger door open with the patient stance of a man who had been doing practical things for people he loved his entire life and had no intention of stopping. The October sun was moving west toward the Blue Ridge, and the ridge was going gold the way it went gold every afternoon at this hour. And somewhere on the other side of it was 45 acres of land with a fence line that needed walking and a south pasture with drainage that wasn't going to fix itself and a row of lavender that came back every year no matter what. I walked to the car. Lou closed the door after me and went around to the driver's side and settled in and started the engine. And neither of us said anything for a moment. The maple tree on the courthouse plaza moved in the October wind, red leaves pulling loose and turning in the light. Ready? Lou said. He looked out at the Blue Ridge. Yeah, I said. Take me home. April came to the Shenandoah Valley the way it always came. Without announcement. Without drama. Simply arriving one morning with warmer air and a different quality of light that turned the ridgeline gold before 8 in the morning and stayed that way until almost 9. 6 months had passed since the morning I had walked the south fence line and heard an engine idling where no engine should have been. The ribs had healed completely by December, which the doctor at the follow-up appointment had described as remarkable for a man my age, and which I had described as adequately tanned since there was fencing that needed attention before the ground froze. Lou had helped with the fencing. He had also helped with the drainage in the back pasture, which had been worse than I thought and had required 2 weekends in a rented trencher and a great deal of language that Eleanor would have tolerated with the patient expression she reserved for men being stubborn about physical problems they should have addressed earlier. The farm was still the farm. Al 45 acres intact. The deed in my name. The way it had always been. The way Eleanor had made sure it would remain. Russell and Diane were facing federal charges that the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office had described in the careful language of people who do not promise outcomes as serious and well documented. Dr. Shaw had surrendered his medical license in January and was awaiting his own proceedings. Dali Whitson had entered a guilty plea in February. The process was ongoing the way legal processes are ongoing. Matured and incremental and entirely removed from the pace of living, which continued regardless. He did not think about them every day. Some days I did not think about them at all. What I thought about most mornings was Eleanor. He carried her letter in my shirt pocket still. Not because I needed to read it. He had the words memorized, every line, including the places where her pen had pressed harder. But because having it there was a kind of continuity. A thread running from that night in the ICU, through the courthouse steps, through the 6 months of ordinary living that had followed. So many things you keep, not because you need them, but because setting them down would feel like a different kind of loss. The grave was in the small cemetery at the back of the property under the oak tree that had been there before we bought the land and would be there long after the land had passed to whoever came next. Eleanor had chosen the spot herself, years before she needed it, on one of her long evening walks. She had come back in and said simply that she had found the right place and wanted me to know. He had not asked how she knew. Eleanor always knew these things. He walked there on the first warm morning in April with a single stem of lavender cut from the row along the south fence. The lavender had come back on its own the way she had said it would. Tough as hell, Lou had said. Comes back every year no matter what. It had not been wrong. I crouched at the stone slowly, with the careful geometry of a 72-year-old man who had learned that the body is more forgiving than it seems if you treat it with a reasonable amount of respect. And I laid the lavender stem across the base of the marker where the granite met the grass. Her name. Didatis. The words she had asked for. She knew how to love well. I had chosen those words alone in the first terrible weeks after she died because they were the truest thing I could say about her in under 10 words. He had not known then how true they were. He understood it better now. It worked, I told her. My voice came out steady, which surprised me a little. 6 months ago, I couldn't say her name without my throat closing. Grief changes shape. Not smaller exactly. Differently worded. Distributed across a broader structure so that any single point bears less than it once did. Everything you set up. Conrad. Patricia. Lou. I love it. It worked exactly the way you planned it. The April wind moved through the oak branches above me, a sound I had heard 10,000 times. And I let it run for a moment before I continued. I've been talking to Conrad about the foundation, I said. The Eleanor Holt Foundation. Legal aid for elderly people facing what I faced. Conservatorship fraud. Asset theft. The things that happen to people when they're vulnerable and the people who are supposed to protect them decide not to. He paused. Conrad's going to help run the legal side. Patricia's already connected us with 3 families at Blue Ridge Regional who need exactly this kind of help. He looked at the stone. I think you'd approve. I think you already approved, actually. I think this is what you had in mind when you left me that $40,000 and told me to use it for whatever came next. A bird moved in the oak tree. A flash of red that was there and then wasn't, gone before I could be sure of it. He stood up slowly, one hand on the stone for balance. The farm spread out below me. The equipment barn. The farmhouse with the screen door I still hadn't fixed. The fence line Lou and I had mended in November. The south pasture where the lavender ran in a thin purple line against the new spring grass. Eleanor's lavender. 41 years of mornings. The land we had bought with money we didn't really have and turned into the thing she had wanted it to be. It was still that thing. He put my hand on the stone for a moment longer than I needed to. The way you keep your hand on something when you're not quite ready to let go of the contact. And I thought about the letter in my shirt pocket and the card with 12 digits and trust him. A on the back and the French lavender water from the shop in Charlottesville and 41 years of a woman who had loved me well enough to plan for my survival from a hospital bed 2 years before she died. Thank you, I said, for all of it. For every piece of it. The wind moved through the oak again. He took my hand off the stone and turned and walked back toward the farmhouse. Down the slope through the spring grass. Past the lavender row that had come back on its own the way she said it would. Being May, the stone sat in the April light the way it always sat. patient and permanent and exactly where Eleanor had said it should be. The screen door caught in the breeze when I reached it, the way it always did when